Welcome back, everybody. We have been discussing workload optimization, and we just finished talking about planning for high availability. And now we're going to jump into planning for disaster recovery. And having that plan is really key to your organization, especially if you've got a lot of resources and farm servers, and if you've got a lot of content, if you have a lot of users. So
yeah, we've kind of been hinting toward it as we were talking about high availability because they go hand in hand, but we're going to give you a good definition of disaster recovery, and then we're going to talk about a disaster recovery plan. And we both mentioned this earlier. You can't have a disaster recovery plan without taking your backup plan into consideration, which is where we're going in the next module. We're going to look at some planning considerations for DR, including the backups and restores. And then we're going to talk about a SharePoint DR strategy. And then because it's so reliant on SQL Server, we also need to have a SQL Server a SQL Server DR strategy. And then I'm going to bring you out to another site that talks about SQL Server DR Options, specifically about SQL Server Disaster Recovery Options, because, as I said, a ton of our data just resides in there, and without SQL, there wouldn't be a SharePoint. So disaster recovery, it's the ability to recover from a situation in which your primary data center hosting your content, SharePoint 2016 content, can't function anymore, is unable to function. And there's an outage. Okay, right now we're in panic mode because SharePoint's not available. It's going to require you to put a plan in place to get you back online. And we talked about the service level agreements, or maybe you don't have one, or you have your business requirements are a little lax and yeah, get it up and running by Wednesday, it'd be great type of thing. But either way, you still have to plan some way to get that content back up and available. So in a disaster recovery is different for everyone. A CFO may be getting ready to do a presentation tomorrow morning. He may lose a document, and that's a disaster for them. And he might be calling you up at home tonight and saying, dude, I just accidentally deleted this document before I went to sleep and before I went to bed, and now I took it out of my recycle bin, and I need that back tonight before my presentation tomorrow. So that's a disaster type of situation, all the way up to a SQL Server getting toasted.
Or even a natural disaster.
Or a natural disaster. You're in California and then mudslides, or you're in the Midwest, you have tornadoes, you're in the East Coast, you have the other things, the
tornadoes.
Yeah, the other things, the hurricanes.
Hurricanes,
that one.
yes. Well, we also have regional, exactly.
Yeah.
And then as we have organizations that are expanding to global enterprises, you have to prepare your environment that maybe you have most of your users in North America, perhaps. You have to consider and plan for that if you've got resources that are in China or in the UK or in Europe. So you want to make sure that everybody is going to be able to have access regardless of the disaster type.
Yeah, exactly. So location, location, location again, and planning, 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 and then documentation. All right, disaster recovery plan is part of your documentation. It should be a well-documented event, step of events, series of events that you're going to take to recover this content and get your system back up and running. And
to have that plan, it makes it faster.
Absolutely.
It makes it so that you can easily say, oh, I can put in my change request. I need to do this now, and override rather than wait a week to fix something.
Or have like a series of Post-it notes and not know what order they're supposed to go in when you're performing these steps. So we're going to introduce a couple terms here when you talk about disaster recovery. RTO, which is the recovery time objective, and then RPO, which is the recovery point objective. And as you can see, duration of the outage is RTO, and measurable acceptable data loss. That's one thing we haven't talked about. We've talked about the fact you may be lenient enough, you may have 2 days, you may have 2 hours, you may only have 2 minutes before you get your system up and running. That's the duration of the outage that's acceptable. But what about acceptable data loss? Maybe it's okay that we lose an hour's worth of data, and that will change our backup recovery, which means we'll change our disaster recovery plan.
Right.
That will change our backup plan, I should say, which will change our disaster recovery plan. So all these need to be well-defined and well-determined before you create your disaster recovery plan, so you're meeting everyone's needs, from the CFO down to the end user, to make sure there's no lost data, or there's a measurable acceptance of data, amount of data. And we're going to make sure that our plan includes all of this as we create this plan. Right. So there's 5 considerations that we have, as we can see here, that's going to go into the planning process. The first one is the granularity of failure and recovery. We touched on this already. It could be a SQL Server. It could be the operating system failed on where SharePoint 2016 is. It could be that we applied a hotfix that broke the operating system, or a component of the operating system. It could just be that we're overtaxing the system. We've got a 386 machine, I don't use those anymore, but we've got a machine that's getting pounded by 20,000 users that just can't take it. So, or it could be down for the end user, as simple as, dude, I lost this document. I took it out of my, emptied it out of my recycle bin. I need it back. How do I get it back? I need this back for a meeting in 20 minutes. It could be last year, the CFO needs a document recovered from last year's year end, and you need to dig through, you're using the unattached content database recovery. You need to find the database, recover that document for the meeting that they've got this month.
I've got another one for you.
What's
not
that?
just a document, or not just, a whole site going down, or the whole, the hardware. What about a list or a library?
Yeah, exactly.
Within SharePoint. That has actually happened in my career administering SharePoint. Is somebody deleted, they thought they were deleting a one specific document or a line item, and they ended up deleting the entire document library that had very sensitive information in it, and it had very important legal documents in it.
Oh, wow.
And it took them 2 weeks to get that library back. So yeah, it's very important to have a plan.
The plan. And the plan, this plan, in addition, should have understand or have well documented where you go to help troubleshoot the problem. Because you may say, oh, the system's down, but what is it? Is it SQL? Is it the operating system? Is it the service app? Is the network down? So you have to know what tools you have available to you in your tool belt to go and say, okay, I'm going to look at the event logs. I'm going to go look at system alerts. I'm going to look at I'm going to run some diagnostic queries to see to help troubleshoot and identify the problem. Remember, we talked earlier on about isolation. All right, we're out at lunch and we get a call saying the system's down. Well, what does that mean? Is the network down? Did I lose a SQL server? Did I lose a web front-end server? You need to be able to quickly isolate that problem. And then you need to validate the problem after we've fixed it. Let's say we've gone through everything, we've fixed everything. It was as simple as a database crashed. Sounds simple, but we had a standby server, or we had mirroring set up. So in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, we redirected to this other database server, we're up and running, we're back out at lunch. Well, we need to validate what happened. We need to make sure we document everything that happened, and we need to make sure the users are happy. Yeah, dude, I was in the middle of accessing or uploading a document. I don't find that document anymore. Or you may have to go to the user and say, you may have lost that last upload that you did. Go back and just recheck your work for the last 20 minutes. I get you back to a database point from 9:30. But check between 9 and 9:30, see what you did there. You may have to re-upload a couple documents. So just make sure, validate that the recovery process did work.
And one thing about the documentation of that particular situation that may have happened is that for some organizations, they have to do auditing very frequently. For instance, finance. The finance industry gets audited a lot for the different types of content that they have. So if a document looks like it has been replicated couple times, that could have serious impact legally for content. So to make sure that it's documented as to what was done, potentially what was lost, how that content was restored, or the messaging that went in to the users themselves. Because if you have that documented, it can save a lot of pain for the organization as a whole.
And we mentioned testing. Testing the recovery procedure. You have it all documented. You can document all you want, but if you don't periodically test at every level of a disaster, whether it be a document down to or up to an entire server or the entire farm, maybe we lose the config database. We can't get to the farm now. We need to make sure we know how to recover from that particular disaster. Every type of disaster that you had. Because documenting it all you want isn't going to fix it if you come up and you try to do a restore of a database and there's nothing on that tape or in that .bak file because something happened during the backup process.
Yeah.
And you can pick up those things by doing test recoveries.
And one thing that I really, really have enjoyed witnessing was an organization I used to work for. They actually did disaster recovery weekend.
Oh, wow.
And what they would do is that they had staged a disaster. And how long did it take for them to put up all of the resources, not just SharePoint Farm, but all of the resources and all the services that were being used within the organization. And they had to do it from Friday at noon to Monday at noon.
Wow.
And it was because they still had a load to deal with. So they started slowing down and turning off different services. And then on Monday morning, the same thing. They were turning them all back on and getting everybody back on line and whatnot. But they did that over the course of the weekend. And a lot of the administrators did not know how to run SharePoint. and they didn't know what services and servers and whatnot. So that was the reason why I was actually hired, because of I understood what they needed for their disaster recovery.
Well, I mean, think about it. I mean, SharePoint talks to Exchange, Active Directory, SQL Server, DNS. I mean, there's a slew of services.
It was very interesting to witness that.
Yeah, I call it SharePoint SOS, System of Systems, because it talks to so many other systems.
Yes, that's right.
Strategize. We have to have a strategy. So we're going to look at a couple options when we're considering a DR strategy. Specifically, because we're near the Pacific Ocean. Specifically, we have 3 types of standbys. It kind of reminds me that 3 bears, the porridge, too hot, too cold.
Yep, that's right.
We have a cold, a warm, and a hot standby. And you can see based on each one of these. A cold standby, kind of back in those days when it was on in Alabama, where it says, yeah, it could be days or hours before we get the content back up and running. Right. Hey, it's cheap to maintain. They're obviously not using it that often. Expensive to recover because depending on what happens, you may be using all physical servers. Maybe that's why they're not too adamant about or worried about it.
Right.
And not taking advantage of some of the virtual server functionality that's available.
Exactly. And that's happened in my experience, is that they had a cold standby going on and they didn't maintain it. They didn't patch it. They like all these little weird nuances that you have for an on-premise scenario, they didn't maintain it. So when we tried to plan disaster recovery, it didn't work out so hot.
So cold's probably the least of our favorite options. Warm gets better, getting warmer.
Getting better.
Secondary option, now you're recovering within minutes or hours. A little less expensive, more, it's inexpensive to recover, but more time consuming because you still have to make the switches. Maybe you need to reconfigure some servers to point to the new server. So a little bit more involved with that process. Your service level agreement becomes a little more instrumental here because the service level agreement's 2 hours. It'll take you 4 hours to redirect for your warm standbys and get ready to recover in a warm standby strategy. Yeah, you're not going to meet your SLA. There's going to be problems there. And then you have your hot standby. This is the most expensive probably to configure and maintain, but it's also the fastest, where we can now recover within seconds or minutes. And that's most often what people want, depending if it's a mission critical application. And you may have a variety of these. You may have some content, your mission critical applications that are hot standby. And you may have some loosey-goosey stuff that's more of a, we'll put that on warm standby. I'd like to be back and be able to access that historical content or archived content, by Friday if we could. So you may have a mixture of hot standby for your mission critical and your warm or cold standby for less critical information. If we're going to do this, obviously there's some system requirements that we have to adhere to in order for this to come together. We have to have redundancy. Did I say that yet?
Yes.
I think a couple times. And it's going to hear a few more times. Failover components. What are we going to fail over to? We're going to fail over to our redundant servers. We're going to have we have special cables because we have unique software or hardware. We're going to make sure we have a backup of those cables in case the cleaners run over a cable with a vacuum cleaner. They probably shouldn't be in your server room, but that's besides the point. We have to have our secondary servers, and pretty much the secondary servers and components need to match your primary servers and components. The platform, the hardware, the number of servers. I can't set up a secondary environment and not have it match my primary environment because there's going to be problems when I try to roll over to that.
Right.
So your operating systems, including all the patches and updates, have to match. Your SQL Server flavors have to match, and your SharePoint flavors have to match. I can't, I can't say I've got SharePoint 2016 over here, and if we have a problem, we're going to roll over to our secondary server that's running SharePoint 2013 Service Pack 1.
Yep.
So we have to make sure everything's lined up and in sync. So it's almost, again, redundancy. It's a mirror effect of what we had before. And then the facility and infrastructure, I've been talking about a cable. What about your load balancers, your DNS entries, your cooling, the cooling system, network? It could be anything. It doesn't have to be SQL Server or SharePoint or the operating system or hardware. It could be any component, DNS, IIS, Exchange. It's not going to bring down your entire system. Active Directory, now we can't get to our user profiles. People can't get authenticated. So there's all sorts of pieces that makes SharePoint SOS, System of Systems, that we need to be aware of. If we do have that secondary server, what do I need to do? Do I need to change a DNS address to switch over, or do I need to configure my network load balancer or hardware load balancer to switch over? So all of these need to be determined as you're building out your DR strategy. Most of our content's residing in SQL Server, right? Right. So we have to have a SQL Server. So you're going to have to be very intimate with your DBA. Now, DBAs are control freaks. I've been a DBA for years. I will absolutely say we're control freaks. And it's our job
Yeah.
to make sure our data is protected. So
Yep.
even as a SharePoint admin and as a SQL DBA, I've had SharePoint people come up to me and I've gone up to DBAs and said, hey, dude, I got this. I know you do, Brian. I absolutely trust you, but I got this. Because they are
Yep.
ultimately responsible. Okay, let's say there's a problem with the database. And I tell the DBA, I'm backing up my content, DBA guy or girl, you don't need to worry about it.
Right.
Well, they're like, all right, I'm going to leave it alone. Ultimately, it comes down, if there's a database problem, it's a DBA's job to make sure that database is protected. So they're going to be wanting to do SQL Server backups.
Yep.
Not only of the content for SharePoint, but also the SQL Server system databases. There's 4 of them. There's a 5th one that's in. We're not going to worry about that one. Master and MSDB are specific to SQL Server. Really not much of an impact on the SharePoint space. But the model database and TempDB, their locations and their customizations can have a huge impact on SharePoint. If you're using the reporting services, there's 2 or 3 databases here.
Yes.
A lot of people take advantage of the SQL Server reporting services. They don't think about backing up that particular content.
Yeah, and like I've worked with a gentleman who was very, very unfamiliar with SharePoint just in general, and wasn't really sure as to what things he would be doing to administer and maintain the health of a SQL Server, what impact that could have on a SharePoint production farm. So it's really important to have that line of communication with your DB and guide them as to the things that you would need, because not all the time will you get to have your control. Because remember, you're a SharePoint administrator, you have just as much control anxiety as a DB would for their environment. So it's really important to make sure you share the stress together.
I have a strategy where you should take your DBA to lunch once a month.
That's right.
Absolutely. Take them to lunch once a month. Get on their good side. Understand what they're doing. Because you may be thinking about upgrading to SharePoint 2016 over Memorial Day weekend. And then you find out over lunch with your DBA that he's going to be out of town that month. But my secondary junior DBA, I just hired him next week. I got to make sure you meet him before I leave. Is going to be in town that weekend. So if you have any problems, you can talk with him. Well, yeah, I might reconsider upgrading that weekend. Because I want to make sure my senior DBA, who I've been working with for a couple years, had many lunches and drinks with, I know I can trust and count on, will be available that weekend in the unlikely event there's a problem with my upgrade. And little nuances like that. One of the sessions I present at conferences is optimizing SQL Server for SharePoint.
Yep.
I could, over several different lunches, I can say, by the way, are we doing this particular option? Have we optimized SQL, a dedicated instance of SQL Server for SharePoint? Have we done this? Have we changed the memory settings? Have we changed the file locations? All of these can come out instead of, because if I walk to a DBA and say, hey, I want you to change this, this, and this. He's politely going to say, please go away.
Or
why. He may be nice enough to say why. But where if I have lunch with them and build up some camaraderie with them, because again, without SQL, SharePoint doesn't exist. You'll be better off with the SharePoint implementation, especially when it comes to DR, disaster recovery, and your backups and your restores. Develop some sort of good rapport with your DBAs.
Well, there's also something else to consider too, that if you do have access to a DBA, then you're able to distribute work effort so that you can focus on the installation. Give the guidance that you need to the DBA as to what you need and have them set it up. And here's some extra resources if you're not quite sure what that means. You know, here's the TechNet articles and whatnot, and kind of continuously educate the DBA to help support the SharePoint environment. But sometimes it's just, you know, there's labor involved in trying to get your SQL set up and planning all that. So if you can divide and conquer, bonus points.
Absolutely. And I always promote the idea of having your own instance of SQL Server. I've had DBAs not knowing, understanding SharePoint, saying, yeah, we've got an instance of SQL Server out there already. Just use that one. We don't want that happening. Because we're going to have all these databases down here we've got to install. We've got to have config database. We've got our content databases. And we have all our service applications on top of central admin. We're going to have a lot of databases. I just looked at my drawing.
And it will make your DB, you know, start scratching his or her head going, oh my goodness, what kind of footprint does this have in our organization? This is mammoth.
Back in 2000, was it 2007 or 10, where you just had all the service apps ran in one database? Now all of those, I think if you do, I call it as a spousal installation. Spousal installations, when you run through, you say, okay. After you do a spouse. So you do that, it's like 20-ish databases get installed. In the old days, if you did a spousal installation, it was like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
So if someone coming in, it's like, oh yeah, I worked with SharePoint 2007, and look at 2013 or 2016, like, whoa, this is a completely different beast now.
Yes, it is.
SQL Server DR Options. So just so you can hold an intelligent conversation, I want you to get familiar with these, with your DBA. Failover clustering is one option. In that chart I showed you earlier, that site we went to, it talked about the DR options or the HA options. We're going to go out to a DR option right now. Depending on the type of database, depending on what you're looking for, these are some of the options we have available for disaster recovery / high availability. Failover clustering, and I'm not going to go to all the definitions because you have them here. The top two are probably the best options available to you depending on what you're looking for. Database mirroring, I put an asterisk next to that. I'm hearing rumors that functionality may go away to some capacity. So again, conversation over lunch with the DBA you'll get a better understanding of what they mean by that feature potentially going away. Standby servers, where you got everything on your primary server is stored on your secondary server. Bam, you can just switch over to that secondary / standby server. Log shipping is just periodically, every hour. All your transaction logs from your primary environment go to your secondary environment. So worst case scenario, we lose the SQL Server database. We just switch gears and look at that secondary server. You can set up what's called a SQL alias. If you create that SQL alias in your SharePoint environment, I can be looking at server 1 now, or a cluster of servers. We'll call it cluster 1. And then we have a problem, and then all of a sudden, they just change that SQL alias. Now we're looking at cluster 2. And it's that easy of a changeover. And we're either using replication or we're using log shipping to keep our content within an hour, maybe a half hour of each other, depending on how often we're log shipping / replicating. So there's options out there. It'd behoove you to understand what they are. So the DBA may say over lunch, like, I think we're going to look at log shipping. Okay, so you have an understanding what that is. You can just ask them to expand on it, and then she can come back and say, or you can come back and say to her, like, well, what about replication? Would that be any better? Well, there's this downside of that. But you can have a conversation with your DBA as to what they're going to be supplying for DR options on the SQL backend, because most of our content's stored there. All right, what do we have for DR options? We are going to go take a peek at this, and we're going to look at a few things. It's really another website I'm going to take you out to. So here's a website that is actually maintained. It's a blog article maintained by a SQL Server Premier Field Engineer. And some of the definitions I introduced to you already, but this has really got a plethora. I have to use that in every course at least once. Plethora of information. It begins with the RTO and RPO and introduces another one called RLO. Talks about high availability, DR, quorums, and then each solution option is described here with pictures. I like pictures. So it walks you through. I think a little bit too fast. Let me go back up here. This is a single site SQL failover clustered instance, or what they call an FCI. It's alphabet soup when you get in the SQL world.
Yes, it is.
And then they have database mirroring described. Again, I'm not going to bore you with all the details. You will have access to the resources associated with this course. And the witness server provides the automatic failing. And then I'm trying not to go too fast, get dizzy. Transaction log shipping, we introduced that. Bam, and I just hit the wrong button. And so I'll just ask you to browse this before you have lunch. So you have just a little bit of an idea what they're talking about with your DBA. So when she sits down and starts explaining stuff, what's a database? Yeah, you don't want to be doing that. She's going to say, yeah, this lunch is over. So just to understand what your DR options by visiting this site here, spending some time perusing through this, and then visit the site we introduced back in the HA, the high availability module, where we talked about per database, the options, the SQL Server option that's going to be best fit for that database type, whether it be central admin, config database, content databases, service apps. This will be your best option to get comfortable with these definitions, terminology, and these options that SQL Server DBAs have to work with when it comes to providing high availability and disaster recovery.
And that's how you can maintain a sense of optimization to your SharePoint environment, and by having these resources readily at hand, because again, things will be changing. Office 365 changes monthly. If new features and services are shuffled around or created for us. And so as you're trying to bring your on-prem environment up to the standards of an Office 365 environment as well, there's a lot of knowledge base out there for you.
So at this point, you should have a pretty good understanding about disaster recovery and HR, or HA. I always spend a lot of time in HR, so high availability. And then disaster recovery plans, what you need to take into consideration for that. We talked about SharePoint DR strategies in comparison to SQL Server DR strategies. Understand that both of them. In fact, I would begin by understanding the SQL Server DR strategies, so it'll help you to implement your SharePoint DR strategy.
Right.
And then we provided you a site that's going to be very helpful in understanding the DR strategies in the SQL Server space, which will have a direct impact on your SharePoint DR strategy.
And we understand that it is a lot of planning.
Absolutely.
And we understand that it is a lot of documentation, but at the end of the day, if you have all that ready, and if there's something bad that does happen, whether it be from software to a hardware to a physical disaster, you are ready to support your organization in a clear and effective manner.
And we're going to do that by planning
Planning
again, and then document. And one key word, again, I'm going to reiterate, it won't be the last time, redundancy. That's what this is all about.
So when we come back into our next module, we will be learning about what?
Backups.
Backups. See you soon.